This is your tribe.
In the past, we're saying there was hidden people. We need to have a new definition of this Greek word called ethnic. And then we use a UPG, unreached people groups, and then there was UUPG, unreached and engaged people group, and now Mission Frontiers and many others were using this term called frontier peoples. For me, as a Chinese speaking person, it's really hard for me to translate that because I understand to a certain degree what you mean by it, but there's no such word directly you can actually translate that kind of meaning.
Right.
So frontier people, maybe you can explain a little bit more to our audience. That's number one. Number two, regarding that, so will you say these are the significant findings in terms of data from the last probably a few decades? You think it's the most important, most strategic mission approach we need to tackle this very group of peoples?
Yeah. So, I was involved in my father's original analysis, and I actually drew the original pie chart with
Oh, really? Yeah,
Yeah,
the famous one, the pie chart.
the very famous first pie chart.
Now it's in every language now.
Yeah. And I know that his first analysis was which people groups had no indigenous churches, no indigenous movements to Christ. That was what defined in the blue sections of his pie chart, which I can show you if you want. But later on, about 20 years, so about in the 1990s, they decided to have this 2% cutoff, because Joshua Project was forming. And when you do things on a computer, you need a number. You can't, to sort things, you can't say more or less, you need sort of a cutoff number. So at first they were going to say 30% Christian, which is ridiculous, and so my dad finally agreed to 2% evangelical. But if you think about it, like I say, in our county, we have 100,000 people. If 2,000 of them are evangelicals, then a movement to Christ has been going for a long time. If 2,000 of them out of 100,000 are evangelicals, so 2% evangelical is actually a pretty high bar. And so what I noticed when we were in India is that there had been this confusion. So unreached people groups now became any people group that had less than 2% evangelical was called an unreached people group. But a number of those unreached people groups actually had movements to Christ that were indigenous. They weren't in the same category as what my father was analyzing. They were in a different category. And so I thought, I wonder what would happen if you took just the ones with 0% Christian, on Joshua Project, 0%. And then people said, well, yeah, but I know there's one Christian there's two Christian. Okay. So I said, okay, not 0%. What if we said less than 1 out of 1,000 Christians of any kind? So we're trying to get the people groups that have no movements to Christ and no indigenous movements, no progress. So in other languages, you can change it to the no progress groups. The reason I use the term frontier, which had to actually negotiate back from the Southern Baptists, I said, can I use this term? Please take it off of your website. And they agreed, is because of the term frontier missiology. My father also started the International Journal for Frontier Missions, which became Frontier Missiology, the International Society for Frontier Missions, which became the Society for Frontier Missiology. That definition for 40 years had been places where you had to send a missionary and there were no believers to work with at all. So the term frontier missions had been, ever since the early 1980s, had been a term that referred to going places where there were no believers to work with at all. So frontier missions, I thought, okay, frontier people groups are the ones that need frontier missions. Frontier people groups are the one where you have to go in and someone has to go from someplace in the world and learn the language for the first time. Someone has to win the very first believers to Christ. There's nobody there to work with at all. Partnership is not possible. And I was concerned because we were getting more and more people who were being sent to frontiers, which is to work with Muslim people, right? where their churches were saying, we won't send you unless you work with the local churches. And we were saying, wait a minute, where we're going, there are no local churches, you know.
No.
So we can't go and work with the local churches. And then the churches were cutting them off. We're saying, well, we're not willing to send any missionaries where they're not willing to work with the local churches. Well, okay.
Yeah, that had been the case for so many church leaders I met, and especially they want to do church planting in the place they don't even have a believer in their context.
Yeah. And
How's you gonna do that?
it was a complete lack of understanding of the nature of frontier mission work. So I said, okay, when we were in India, and I realized, wow, there's billions, literally, there's 1 billion people in India who have no churches in their people group, in their language, in their, you know, in India is a very unique place because of the caste system, you know, and even the Pew Foundation, you know, which has done all these interviews and stuff, have found that 90% even of the young people in India are not willing to marry outside of their caste, you know, because it has all sorts of spiritual implications. It has, you know, ritual cleanliness implications. It has job possibility implications, where you can go and get a job or not. You know, it's got huge, and almost all of the believers in India are either in isolated tribal groups, because we've done very well with tribes, or they're in outcast groups. So Dalits, these groups were never part of the caste system. They've never been allowed in the temples. The Hindu temples are not even allowed. And even the Muslim groups in India, because castes are defined by traditional occupations, even the Muslim groups have their outcast groups that are the butchers, you know, the people that deal with mud and unclean things, you know, are outcasts. And then the farmers are, you know, slightly better, and so on. So even in the Muslim groups have their castes in India. But these groups were being completely left off the charts of, so people sending people to work with Christians in India, to partner with Christians in India, and it was all among the tribes and the groups that are having movements, which are these outcast Dalit groups.
Yeah, I think we need to just come back to what is really on your heart, which is the frontier peoples, and then the urgency of sending more workers over there. However, today, as a mission mobilizer, and we realize the challenge is, you know, there are priorities that the church leaders really consider as our, like, the vision of the church, which is probably not aligned with your thinking. Well, no matter what kind of priority we're setting up, the agenda and our, you know, our desire, not really our desire, but, you know, this is really on God's heart. Especially some setback, like some arguments in terms of like urban ministries was very important, ministries and mission opportunities at your doorsteps, especially for global gateway cities. A lot of rich people groups coming to the global gateway cities, and the ministry opportunities over there. We can do something about it, and I totally agree with that. We need to start from somewhere. But how do you see that? And is that an argument, or there's is something, nothing, or everything?
Okay. First of all, let me say that I sat down to try to calculate how many of the frontier people groups have populations in the diaspora. Okay, because people are saying, well, let's work with the people in the diaspora. If these countries are hard to get into, these Muslim countries, or if these Hindu groups in India, virtually none of the caste Hindu groups that are frontier people groups still have people in the diaspora. I mean, they have no, by which I mean they have no large communities, with the exception of the Gujarati. There's like Gujarati communities in England. So in some places there are a whole community of people that you could work with. Okay. But less than 2.5% of the people in frontier people groups are in any diaspora. Then I thought, okay, well, let's look at where those people are going, right? 2.5%. It's not great, and then I found out that most of them are going to like Muslim countries. So for example, the Indians that are Muslims that are working outside of India or outside of Pakistan or outside, they're working in Dubai, they're working in the Gulf states, or we were of course working in Morocco. The largest population of Moroccan Arabs that's outside of the country is in Egypt. There are some in Europe, but the largest population is in Egypt. So one of the reasons why these frontier people groups are having no progress is because they're having no contact with Christians. And they have very, very few people in the diaspora to have contact with Christians. So as much as it's great to work with unreached people groups in the diaspora, the unreached people groups that tend to be in the diaspora, well, first of all, most diaspora people groups are reached people groups. So let's just make that clear. People from Latin America, people from there, they're almost all reached people groups. And they send pastors, 40% of the missionaries from Latin America go to North America, and they go as pastors to the diaspora peoples.
Yeah.
But
same as Chinese, of course. Yeah.
right, yeah. So Chinese will send missionaries to the Chinese diaspora. But if you look at, like, say, for example, my sister who lives in Detroit, they have large Yemenis communities there. The Yemenis are a frontier people group. And but they're very insular, and so people come and try to witness to these Yemenis people there, and sometimes they can make some progress if you actually move in among them and they are willing to trust you and become your friends, and you even try to learn their language. You might have some contact with them, but otherwise they see you as a threat to their community. So have like short-term groups coming in from a church who don't know anything about Islam, that we're just trying to, they see that as an attack on their community. Why are you trying to make us into Christians? So it's not necessarily simpler or easier. I want to say something about megacities, because we lived in the city of Delhi for 5 years. And of course, we were trying to see why it was difficult for our workers to find and work with any frontier people, Muslim people group in particular. And about 20%. There were more Muslims in the city of Delhi than in the country of Lebanon, just to give you an idea, because of the population. There's like 20 million people in Delhi and something like 5 million people in.
Crazy.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we found out is that in cities, it's particularly difficult to disengage your identity from being with the local Christian churches, which the Christian churches in Delhi were mostly a conglomeration of people from different people groups. People from Kerala, people from tribes, people, Dalits, all mixed together in these Christian churches. But they were very Western. They were in English. They had songs, hill songs and other songs that we understood and knew. We felt very much at home in any of these. And their ability to reach out to Muslim people groups was virtually none, because they wanted the Muslims to come to their church, when they really needed to send the person as a cross-cultural missionary. So trying to identify with the Muslims. So we tried to identify with Muslim people groups. And there were factions, of course. There were the Sunni Muslims, there were the Shia Muslims who don't get along at all. And we ended up working with Shia Muslims. And I couldn't find a single other person. While I was there for 5 years, I couldn't find a single other person in India that was working with Shia Muslims, of which also multiple groups, so I was working with only one Shia Muslim group. And I thought, you have to really focus. If you really want to reach a frontier group in a city, you have to ignore everybody else You have to really try to move into their community. You know, you have to find people of peace in that community. You have to identify with their view of reality, their problems, you know, help them with their issues. And that has to become the love of your life, is that people group.
Oh,
You can't sort of say, oh, I'm going to witness to everybody. And, you know, I don't know. It's much harder than it is when you have an isolated tribe in a jungle in some ways. Now, you know, you don't have cannibals, you don't have them killing you and all this, but you have the problem of them feeling like you're a foreigner and your God is not going to be their God.
yeah.
Very, very strongly, they are trying to, even in these mega cities. So it's sort of like being a diaspora into a mega city, right? Because they're moving in, but the rest of their families back home.
Yeah.
How do you actually become a belonger? Now, Chris Clayman, he went for 2 years, I think it was, to West Africa, to Mali. He learned the language of a tribe, etc. By the time he moved to New York City, he could find his people group because he knew their language. He had
Mm.
and he knew their cultural background and how they viewed reality and the seasons of their life, and you know how they raised children and all of this. He could so, in fact, they were like, you are one of us, you know, you understand us, you know.
Yeah. That's
Told him
crazy.
but most people that are trying to reach out to diaspora have no idea of what their home life and their home culture is,
Yeah, that's right.
or their home language. And so they don't have that kind of connection. So Chris Clayman, you know, started
Yeah, by the
Global.
way, Chris Clayman is the new director of Trust Joshua Project, just that people know who he is.
Right. And he is the founder of Global Gates, which was
Yes.
to encourage people to work with diaspora groups. And I think the most successful people I have seen that work with diaspora groups are the ones who already lived in the other place and and
Mm,
and knew the language and stuff. And so even though they were kicked off the field, maybe because of children's health problems or any one of you know, maybe they were blacklisted, India
mm,
blacklisted all the time, if they can find the people group that they were working with, they have an immediate in because they say, oh, you understand who we are.
yeah.
But it's not
I,
simple.
I yeah, I can listen to you all day, but we need to wrap up now. But just the final words. How so how can you encourage mobilizers? You know, this is our tribe. So how can you still encourage mobilizers like us, to still have faith in what they're doing and just continue the grind and to serve the church, to encourage people, challenge people
Yeah,
to
I
step out
really
of their comfort zone and to make a difference.
I really think the most important thing for people going to frontier people groups is clarity. In other words, if it seemed this amorphous task, then nobody can do it. But if you go to joshuaproject.net/frontier/interactive, you get this wonderful map, which has little circles all over the map where all the frontier people groups are, the ones that don't have any progress of the gospel, whatever you want to term you want to use in Chinese, no progress of the gospel groups. And you can, you know, click on one or the other, see where the group is, see what language it speaks. You know, you can go to a whole profile. You can even sort them. So like when I'm working with people in India that are Indian Perspectives course, I say, look, you know some Indian languages. So go down, see the languages, pick the languages you know, click on the bar that's for your language, say it's Marathi or something, and you will see which frontier people groups speak your language. When you're coming from a Chinese background, you know, you can pick the country, you can look at different things and you need to become specific. You need to understand, I could go, you know, 70% of the frontier people groups are in South Asia. 70% of all of the remaining frontier people groups, both by number, by count, and by population. But if you look at just the 300 largest frontier people groups, those that are greater than 1 million, it's still true. It's still 70% in South Asia, 30% everywhere else. but you can pick. And why have sort of a vague idea and a vague sense of guilt, when you can have a really specific, and what happens is when people start praying for these specific groups, they get to know them better. They start to feel called. I met a man who spent 30 years turning the Albanian from being a frontier people group. Now it's still an unreached people group, but the church is growing so strongly at 1%, he doesn't think missionaries need to go anymore. He started out in Wyoming praying for the Albanians. And finally he said, who's going to go? And he couldn't find anybody who was willing to go. So he and his wife went, and they spent 30 years there, starting from before the communist regime fell, when they couldn't even get in the country. So they were in a country next door learning the Albanian language. Finally were able to get in, and a whole people group with millions of people in it is now believers. Not only that, the Albanian believers have produced this website called blessfrontierpeoples.org, blessfrontierpeoples.org, where you can pray for the 31 largest frontier people groups, the ones that are greater than 10 million in size, because they, even though they're still an unreached people group, they wanted to be part of finishing, getting the gospel to people who don't have them. Yes, that exact 31 prayer guide, which you can download for free at go31.org or buy hard copies. And you can also buy The Great Progress of the Gospel booklet, which has all the statistics I'm talking to you about. If we understand, we can motivate people so much better if it's not a vague,
Mm, mm.
there's this
Amen.
in the Bible that says, how can the army go forward if without a clear bugle call or something like that? And
Mm,
that's what I think is the task of mobilizers, is they have to clarify and make them human, make you see that these people groups are human. They're lovely people.
mm,
They don't have the gospel, and thank God, the gospel was brought to my people group. I'm sure you thank
mm,
God that the gospel was brought to your people group by many people who suffered a lot in order to get it there. And these other people groups now would be so blessed to have the gospel, to have their relationship with Jesus Christ, to a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and we have to think of them as actual human beings that are waiting to hear the gospel. People complain to me and say, oh, they're not waiting. They don't know anything about Jesus. And I said, they know enough about Jesus to know that he's not for them, that he's not going to save them in most cases now, because of the global, internet and everything. They know that there's this Jesus out there, but he's not going to save them. They need to be told that yes, he's theirs too, and that God is for their people group too, and he's not going to tear their families apart. He's not going to, destroy their culture. He's going to give them a future and a hope. And a lot of these people have never even met a single believer,
Yeah. Yeah, Lord have mercy on us. Thank you very much, Becky, for your time and for your passion. And I really learned a lot today. And hopefully we can continue this work as mobilizers, as partners. We just pray there will be more labors to serve, and the harvest is plentiful. Thank you very much for your time, and just until next time, and God bless you.
Okay, thank you too.